Hey everybody. One of my subscribers said, why don't you do a soft spoken video instead of a whisper video? And another subscriber suggested, talk a little bit about why you became a counselor, how that came about. And I'm going to try that. So I will tell you right now that it's weird for me to speak and not do whispering while I'm doing this video. And it's also a challenge not to be tapping anything. But because I like to do different things and I like to listen to my subscribers, I thought I would try it. So here we go. Let me know in the comments if you like it or if there's anything else you'd like me to try. So, first of all, I grew up in Florida and my family was very poor. So when I was getting out of high school, I really didn't have the money to go to college, nor did I want to go into construction, which is what a lot of my family had done. And I just happened to be at a high school basketball game when I was a senior. And I came out of the game, and there was a friend of mine who was sitting there by the name of David. And he was talking about having enlisted in the Air Force. So I thought, oh, the Air Force, that's a possibility. Money for school, training, something to do. I didn't want to go into construction. I wanted to do something different. So what I did was the next week I contacted the Air Force recruiter who was named Jack Whittington. I still remember his name very well. He was a tech sergeant. And just a couple weeks later, I was on a bus to Miami over the holiday period to get my physical done, and I delayed enlisted in the Air Force. So, end of the summer, I'm on another bus going back to Miami to go to Air Force Basic Training, which is in San Antonio, Texas. I had never flown on an airplane before. Went down to Miami, flew to San Antonio, and started my Air Force time. Long story short, I ended up in medical tech school, had never considered going into medicine in any way, shape, or form, but I ended up as an Air Force medic. Went to school in Wichita Falls, Texas, which is Air Force Med Tech School. Actually, I loved it. I loved the work. I loved the job. And got orders to Hill Air Force Base, Utah. I literally had to look at a map on the wall to figure out where Utah was. I knew it was somewhere out west, but I didn't know where. Ended up at the hospital, Hill Air Force Base Hospital. Was assigned to obstetrics and gynecology. So here I am, an 18-year-old kid who's just out of tech school helping deliver babies. And I did that for several months, maybe a year, possibly. And then I was transferred to the emergency room, which is what I wanted to do. Went through EMT school at a local college, which was great because that gave me the idea that I could actually succeed in college. And none of my family had ever gone to college. So did that. Became friends with a psychiatrist who used to do a shift in the emergency room every now and then. They made all the doctors do that, whether you were a pediatrician or a psychiatrist or a surgeon. You had to do time in the emergency room, at least 1 or 2 shifts a month. And this doctor, really liked him a lot. His name was Alan Heap, and he had a mental health clinic within the hospital, very small, just him, a psychologist, a social worker, and a tech. And the technician would do initial screenings, and the tech would also do intakes, things like that. I think he may have even run a group. But the technician, his last name was Vittner. I can't remember his first name. He was out on some kind of medical issue for a while. And the psychiatrist asked my boss if I could come down and fill in the mental health clinic. And I had never seen a counselor or a psychiatrist or psychologist or anyone in my whole life. So I had no idea what I was doing other than I would be doing intakes on people, doing some testing, possibly just helping schedule folks. And I went down there and found that I really enjoyed working with the psychologist, with the psychiatrist, with the social worker, and also with the clients, the patients. They were wonderful people. They all had good stories I would hear when I did intakes. So that was how I was first exposed to mental health and mental health treatment. So a few months later, I tried to transfer from being a regular medic to being a psychiatric technician, a psych tech, and staying in the clinic. But Air Force didn't want to do that, so I ended up doing a lateral retrain into intelligence operations, which is something I wanted to do early on in the Air Force and didn't have a chance. So went to that school, lost contact with the psychiatrist friend, went to Florida, transferred to Florida, and I worked with Air Force Special Operations for a couple of years. And then I had 6 years in the Air Force, but I really wanted to go to college. So I took my Air Force college money, separated from the Air Force, went back to Utah because I already had a couple of classes from my EMT training at the local university, which was Weber State University. So I went back there, and then I happened to, I got a job as a medic in a Job Corps site. So I was working as a medic. I was had bought a small house near the college, near Weber State University, and I was planning to do pre-med. One night I went to an Italian restaurant near the university with my wife, and I ran into that psychiatrist from the Air Force. He had just separated from the Air Force and had started a psychiatric inpatient unit at a hospital called St. Benedict's Hospital, which doesn't exist anymore. It's now, I believe it's South Ogden Regional Medical Center. But at the time, it was a Catholic hospital, and he had started an inpatient psych unit. And he said, "Hey, why don't you come work for me as a psych tech?" And I'm like, okay. They were just starting the unit, so myself, several other techs, nurses, some therapists, I think there were 3 therapists at the time, we all went through training together, and I started working there while I was going to school. Loved working at the hospital, doing crisis in the emergency room, running inpatient groups, talking individually to people. I even got to do a little bit of case management when some of the case managers who were all master's level counselors or therapists were not available for some reason, and we had a high patient count. I would be a case manager under instruction of somebody, but I really enjoyed the work. Now, at the same time, I'm a pre-med major at Weber State and found that my science background was really poor, and I'm an impatient person. So I stopped just going to some classes, and my GPA plummeted. It was terrible. one of the lessons I learned from that was that if you are failing a class, withdraw rather than just stop going, because it's hard to overcome zeros. And I had quite a few zeros that first semester. Anyway, as part of my degree program, I started taking criminal justice and psychology courses just because I really wasn't doing well in the sciences, and I got A's in those classes. They were far more interesting to me. So I ended up getting a bachelor's degree in criminal justice with a minor in psychology. And at the time, I was considering, well, should I try to get into a master's program, master's in social work or master's in psychology, or should I do something else? Well, I had 6 years in the military at the time, and I thought, well, I want to go back and be an officer and get paid more money, use my 6 years towards retirement, and it would just be a great opportunity. So I applied for the Coast Guard as an officer, and I'd gone to the Air Force but couldn't get in because they were only taking pilots and computer science majors, and I didn't really want to be a pilot, nor did I feel like I had no background in computer science, so that was a non-starter. But the Coast Guard was accepting applications for officer candidate school, so I applied to OCS, got accepted. Didn't realize how hard that was to do, because I believe there were 400 applicants and they took like 40 people. But I got in, became a Coast Guard officer, did that for 14 years, and then I retired. But while I was in the Coast Guard, I started thinking, I really want to go back into psychology and counseling. And I was fortunate enough to be at an assignment in Washington, D.C., where I was supported by my commanding officer, and I was allowed to do a internship program. And I started at Marymount University in the counseling program, counseling psychology, got my master's degree, had been hired by Utah Valley Mental Health in Salt Lake City, Utah, and by Salt Lake Community College to teach psychology, separated from the Coast Guard to go start my counseling career. And I was planning to be a reservist, so that's just part-time military in San Francisco. But I started my job in Salt Lake working for Valley Mental Health. I had my new master's degree in counseling psychology, and I was teaching psychology to nursing students at Utah Valley State College, which is a huge community college. I guess maybe a 4-year college, but it's pretty much everyone lives at home in Utah. And so I'm back in Utah doing that. I had graduated in August from Marymount, August of 2001. Just started my job around mid-August, I believe. We all know what happened on September 11th. So September 11th, I'm a civilian, haven't started with the reserves yet, and I'm working a full-time mental health job. I was on a program the Coast Guard had called temporary release for 2 years, which meant at the end of a 2-year period, you could either go back in the Coast Guard at your same rank, or you could be a reservist, stay in the reserves. I had not started my reserve job yet, and I was working. Came out one morning, and my wife was saying, "Oh my God, something's happening in New York." It was the attack on the Twin Towers. So that happened in September, and I felt guilty for not being in the service at that point after 9/11. And I think I made a phone call, or I reached out to the assignment officers who handled Coast Guard officer assignments, and they brought me back in the Coast Guard by February of 2002. So 5 or 6 months I was out, and then I was back on active duty. And I went to a intelligence fusion center in the Pacific, and I did anti-terrorism, counterterrorism analysis. I had some experience with intelligence analysis from my second job in the Air Force, so they sucked me back into that. Spent 6 years at the Maritime Intelligence Fusion Center doing various jobs, chief of counterterrorism, senior analyst. I ran the watch, the 24-hour watch for the Pacific. But as things started to calm down from 9/11, I started thinking, well, what am I going to do now? I've been in the Coast Guard. I'm a lieutenant commander. Hadn't really thought about, at that point, getting back into psychology. And the assignment officer said, well, you've been at this job for 6 years, which is uncommon, this fusion center. And they said, if you want to make Commander 05, you need to go back to the field. And so I went to Los Angeles, Long Beach, and worked as the enforcement chief. So I was in charge of all law enforcement activity in Los Angeles. And then decided I wasn't going to stay in the service after 20 years. I didn't want to be locked into LA. I had, at the time, my wife and I were getting a divorce, so there was lots of turmoil in my life. And so I ended up retiring in 2007, and then getting divorced somewhere after that. My children were in Utah, and I was in Utah for a little while, and then I went to California and met my current wife, Kate, and we ended up, we had a good life. And I, at that point, again, I wanted to get back into doing counseling, but I wasn't sure how to do it. Followed my wife, Kate, to Hawaii for her job. And while I was there, I worked for the Army as a sexual assault victim advocate. So got additional training in sexual assault, managing cases, doing that kind of thing. But I was finally back into doing mental health, and I felt good about the job. I really did. And my wife left her job after a few years when we were having our second child. So 2 older sons, 2 younger sons. When Kate and I were having our second little boy, we moved back to California, and I was working for the government at that time. I continued to do that for another, how long? Close to 10 years, and then ended up in Maryland and became a licensed counselor here, and that's what I'm doing presently. The great thing about that is when we first came back here, I was commuting into D.C., working at Coast Guard headquarters, and it was awful. The commute was terrible. And when I retired, I looked for something up in this area north of D.C., and I actually have an office that I'm sitting in today, and I'm about 10 minutes from my house. So really, it's just been a crazy journey for me to get back to doing what I feel like I'm best suited for. So what do I like about counseling? That's a good question. Someone else asked me about that. I really like the creativity of it, and I like helping people. So, as I said before, I came from a very poor family. We did not have anyone in my immediate family who graduated from high school, no one who went to college. And I think that inspired me in a lot of ways to value that, to value school. I have 2 master's degrees. I have 1 master's degree that I worked for several years. That's my counseling degree from Marymount University in counseling psychology. And I worked the whole time that I did that. And I have a second master's degree that was paid for by the Coast Guard in science and technology intelligence. So I have two master's degrees, one being a technical degree, an MS, and the other one being my counseling degree, which is an MA, which means something to somebody, I'm sure, but Master of Arts or Master of Science. And I think just the things I've been exposed to over the years, sexual assault, sexual harassment, trying to help people who have had trauma, all those things, I value them. It's being able to get in with a person, talk to them, push them a little bit to dig into what's really bothering them in their life or creating their depression or their anxiety. Trauma is a complicated issue, and I'm a trauma specialist. I've taken additional training in that. Trauma can be one event that is traumatic, that gives you post-traumatic stress disorder. For instance, someone in a war zone, a soldier, a rape. It can be a long-term abusive relationship that people get into, and from the outside, others will look in and say, well, why are you in there? Why don't you just leave? Why don't you do this? Some people don't have an option. They don't feel they have an option. So again, it's one of those things where it can be very complicated. There's another kind of abuse that can lead to trauma. It's long-term, sustained, small things. For instance, a child who's been criticized by parents. Oh, you never do anything right. Oh, you're always wrong. You're bad. Or you're in a marriage and your spouse treats you badly over and over and over again. Those kind of things can also lead to trauma. And the same kind of PTSD symptoms that people who have a huge event that everyone recognizes as being traumatic, small things over extended periods of time can give you the same kind of feelings, the same kind of symptoms. So again, I think what I bring to the table as a counselor is being able to understand some of these things, that I've been exposed to them. And again, cultural differences, everyone is unique, everyone is different. Everyone comes up with a different set of beliefs, a different set of circumstances. And to me, that's interesting. It's not anything that I take for granted. When I meet a person, I try to be open to what they're bringing to the table, what they're talking about, what their values are, and not criticize or judge people. One of the therapists that I follow closely, that I actually do this kind of therapy, is rational emotive behavior therapy by Albert Ellis. He was one of the founders of cognitive behavioral therapy. And Ellis would say that the best thing is to not judge yourself, and that is universal self-acceptance. And also not judge others, which is universal other acceptance. And the third thing is universal life acceptance. In other words, you try to see things realistically for how they are. And if you have to judge yourself or judge another person, not judging is the best thing. But if you have to judge, if you feel it's some way to judge the performance, not the person. Because people sometimes will make decisions that they don't know why they did it, but there's probably a reason for what they did. And I try to keep that in mind, because even with an abusive partner, there's a reason that person is abusive. We may not understand it, we may not know it, but there's something that drives them to those actions. And it's easy to have compassion for the victim, but the person who is abusing is also probably dealing with something very complicated and very painful. So again, I'm not excusing any behaviors, but what I think is that I try to bring that sense of I don't know what's happening here, and then you deal with what it is in the best way possible. So again, I like to try and help people, and I'm not perfect. There are some days I come in and I feel really good about the work I do, and other days when I come in and I have no idea what's going on. And I try to be compassionate with myself in that way too. One thing that is important to me is to show up every day, to be consistent for my clients, and to try and not judge them and just help them find solutions to get the answers they need. One of the ethical guidelines for counselors is that every client has autonomy, and I believe that. I think that it's not for me to judge what a person needs to do. I can give them guidance. I can help them explore their feelings and emotions and make decisions, but it's their decision, and I cannot decide for them. I don't want to push my values onto a person. I have had clients that are different sexual orientations. I've had clients who are struggling with simple things or complicated issues that they've been dealing with their whole lives. And again, I don't have all the answers, but I want to help my clients find their answers and their truth. So anyway, this is my soft-spoken video. If you liked it, let me know. I can always do more of these. I can always talk about other issues or rambling things. And I can do more of my traditional whispering and my tapping videos, because I know some people really enjoy that. So again, this is it. I appreciate everyone if you stayed this long, and leave a comment and a like, and I will see you in the next video.